Our guest today is Russ Roberts. Russ is an economics educator, author of many significant books and the occasional rap video. He's a fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution and the creator and host of one of the world's leading economics podcasts, EconTalk. He's an expert craftsperson when it comes to podcast interviewing, which is why we're speaking today. And I'm especially excited to speak with Russ, as I've been an avid listener of EconTalk since I first started listening to podcasts about a decade ago. Russ, we're really happy to have you with us.
Great to be with you.
And for those who don't know, how would you describe EconTalk?
Well, it's interesting you called it an economics podcast. It started that way. It started back in 2006, which was a very long time ago. We've since done about a little over 750 episodes, which is mind-blowing, each about an hour long. And it started off, I was interviewing economists, people I had either studied with at the University of Chicago or friends of mine in the profession or other folks. And somewhere about 5 years ago, I don't know, I haven't looked, but somewhere in the somewhat recent past, I started widening its range. I mean, I always interview people other than economists, but I interviewed people who were doing work related to economics, historians or psychologists. But in recent years, I've branched out considerably, and it's still okay to call it EconTalk because I'm an economist, but its subject isn't particularly economics per se anymore. It's really anything, to be honest, it's anything I'm interested in, which is increasingly philosophy, cultural issues of the United States, the state of our country and the democracy, and the tension that's obvious in public discourse, the role of social media perhaps and technology and causing that. So it's my new tagline is conversations for the curious. So I'm curious. I hope listeners are too, and I try to learn something each episode from a guest.
Yeah, and so then let's go back to the beginning with younger Russ, because I think I would imagine that the conversations for the curious being your interest, there are roots that go back. So I'm curious, when you were younger, did you interview people? Did you get on stage? Did you have an interest in media? And I know your dad inspired you towards poetry. Did you have any other kinds of interests towards creation at a young age?
It's interesting you asked that. A lot of people asking about how EconTalk got started, but you're asking a deeper question, which is how I got started as an interviewer. And it's funny that there are quite a few hints that I would be interested in podcasting. I remember being at an economics conference with a buddy of mine, and we were doing some shopping outside the conference time, and I was talking to some salesperson, and I was asking her a bunch of questions, and my buddy called me the question box because I was just like to ask people stuff. When I was in a business school at Washington University in the Olin School of Business, Washington University in St. Louis, I had forgotten about this for a while, but I started a series where I was running something called the Management Center. I invited business leaders to have conversations with students. And the format for that was I would interview them, and then we did Q&A, and then we would print a transcript of those interviews. And that was sort of an early example of EconTalk. Yeah. And I realized I didn't really think about it, but I do like interviewing. I also like talking, which is a handicap in an interviewer. If you go back to the early days of EconTalk, I talked, I think, a little too much, and still talk too much sometimes. But I'm curious. I think that helps.
Yeah. Well, I can see kind of the path forming there when you were at Olin. And you mentioned,
We had, we had a name for. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. I gave it what I thought was a catchy name at the time. Some kind of conversations. It was called. I can't remember. I'll dig it up. But yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, please do. And if there's any links or anything we could share, I'd be glad to take a look at it. And so then, going fast forwarding a little bit to maybe 2005, 2006, you said before that you started EconTalk when you realized you were late to the blogging scene. But I guess set the context. What was the world of podcasting and internet media like in your eyes back then?
Pretty embryonic. For me, it was a question of how much time I was able to devote to it. I didn't know how long it would take to create an episode. I didn't know if I could create a regular episode. There's another part of me that you didn't ask about, or I didn't mention when you're talking about when I was younger, which was I always thought it might be interesting to have a talk show on radio. And one of the things I wondered was whether I could do that in any regular, ongoing way and keep the rest of my responsibilities as a faculty member or a teacher going. And when podcasting started, I realized, well, this is where I could have my own radio show, which is what it is. And it wasn't obvious then that's what it was. It was this weird thing. When you tell people you did a podcast, they say, what's that? And I'd say, well, it's kind of like a radio show you can listen to whenever you want. It's stored on the internet. And, I started it thinking, well, this is interesting. I was surprised at how many people would listen. At the time, I'd been a guest on a program, and I asked the host how many people listen. He said, well, I don't know, but about 3,000 people downloaded. And I thought, well, that's a big number. 3,000 people seems like a big number. Of course, it's not by modern podcasting standards, but it still seemed cool that you could go into a room, the equivalent of a virtual room, and there'd be 3,000 people in the audience wanting to hear what you had to say or hear what you had to say in concert with the guest. So I thought this is, exciting and worth doing. And pretty early on, I realized that if I wanted to build up a regular audience, it had to be every week. That people would have an expectation of when it would come out. So that relentless schedule was the hardest part. And, I wasn't sure I would be able to do it. And yet here we are 750 episodes later. I seem to have managed it. But that was the question. And in those days, people listened to, there were no smartphones. At least in my memory, there weren't any smartphones. I can't remember when the iPhone came out. But people listen to podcasts in two ways. They either had an iPod, which was a MP3 player that Apple had created. Now it seems like I'm talking about
ancient technology.
The first dishwasher or something. Something back in the 19th century, or the grain combine. But you'd listen on an iPod or an MP3 player. An iPod was the dominant player at the time. Or you'd burn a CD. You'd burn a compact disc with the audio on it and play it in a CD player. And nobody listened in their cars unless they had a CD player and they burned a CD to listen in their car, which people did. But most people would listen walking with their iPod. Not that many people had. I mean, a lot of people had iPods, but nothing like smartphone penetration. So the early days, it was this weird sort of funky thing that some people were able to access or knew how to access. I remember giving my dad and mom an MP3 player preloaded, a cheap one that I bought, and preloaded it with a bunch of episodes because they couldn't figure out how to play it on the web. And I sent them the MP3 player, and the first question, I bought a few of them. They were inexpensive. I bought one to have just in case he couldn't figure out how to use it, my dad. And sure enough, he called and he said, where's I want to say he said, where's the manual? Actually, I think I'd include the manual. And he said, well, I can't figure out how to turn it on. And I gave it to my kid who was like, I think 7 at the time or 9 or something young. And he turned it on in 15 seconds. He just kind of fiddled around with it. But for my dad, it was like, I don't see a button that says on off, so I don't know what to do. He was probably 75 at the time, 70 something. And, that whole world of players and technology has changed so much. And so most of my listeners commute or commuters. And right now, of course, there's less commuting because of the pandemic. But most of my listeners historically are commuters who listen in their car through their smartphone or listen while they're jogging or exercising, working out at the gym to their smartphone. And that's just a total transformation of what was available in 2006. And I was lucky enough to get started early on.
Yeah, and so what was that that startup process like? You mentioned kind of having to balance this decision of the time investment versus, it's kind of this new unproven technology. How did you make that decision?
Well, I could have been wasting my time, but no idea. And of course, at the time, there was no way of knowing other than the occasional email I'd get or whether many people were listening. The other part of it was we did all our interviews via the phone. So I had to have a technology for recording phone conversations. If you go back and listen to the early episodes from 2006 and 7, the audio quality is not very good. Besides the interviewer not being very good, the audio quality is not so good because they're done over the phone. And if you go back and listen to the ones that are from the United Kingdom or England typically, they're really mediocre because the phone system the connection wasn't as good to calling England. And but for me, I don't know why I kept at it. So part of what I'm telling you is I didn't get that much encouragement from it wasn't like I was having this big success or anything.
Right.
I think it was moderately successful early on. I wasn't sure, but I enjoyed it, and I thought it was a good experience to try to keep it up. And of course, 2008 came along, which was the financial crisis, and the interest in economics went through the roof. And so my listenership and audience grew dramatically between 2008 and 2010. And then I think it probably plateaued. And then it started growing again probably 5 or so years later as people became more and more able to access podcasts. But, for me, the other part of it was I just like talking to smart people every week.
Yeah.
When I look back on it, it's along with graduate school, it's the single most, not along with it, it's probably more important than graduate school in my intellectual development. My exposure to the ideas and my prep for those episodes, reading the books and essays and articles by the authors to prepare for the interviews just had an enormous impact on my intellectual journey and kept me from getting stagnant or stale intellectually. So, it would be worth doing even if nobody was listening.
Yeah.
In a way, the listenership is just great. And the emails I get from listeners, are incredibly gratifying. But it's been gratifying just for me through the process itself.
Yeah. Well, you describe kind of a beautiful flow and evolution of EconTalk, which I've been lucky enough to kind of be with you, experiencing some of these different eras and epochs of EconTalk over time. I guess one last question on kind of the startup and the overtime. But did you ever think about quitting or putting it down for a while? Because weekly is quite an intense schedule, and I wonder how you think about that.
Well, I like the discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's hard to do it every week, and it took me a while to realize that I probably don't want to interview an author every week. I want to mix in some people who haven't written books because I like to read the book. So,
right.
Reading 50 books a year is challenging. If you go back and look, I probably, besides the other books I want to read,
right.
But if you go back and look, I probably, let's say I interviewed 20 authors a year, 30 maybe, some in a year where there's a lot of them. So that's still a lot of reading.
Yes.
To go with the other reading I want to do. And of course, one of the things that changed over time is that I tried to find ways to interview the people whose books I wanted to read rather than the other way around, right? That was sort of the goal, was let's pick books that I want to read so I can get them in. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to read them if I'm still doing EconTalk. But, I like discipline. I don't think I ever thought about quitting. actually. The program is supported by the Library of Economics and Liberty, which is a website out of a foundation in Indianapolis called Liberty Fund.
Yeah.
And Liberty Fund's the sponsor. Library of Economics and Liberty is the larger website that EconTalk's a part of. So, they were always eager to be helpful to me. They paid me to produce it, so it wasn't like it wasn't just a labor of love, although it is a labor of love. Just we were making progress. Our audience grew steadily, and as I said, some years it grew dramatically. It was fun. It was fun to do. I never just thought, this is just too time consuming. It is time consuming, and of course you can spend as much time as you want marketing it and on it along the way to do more preparation. And the challenge is figuring out ways to prepare for every week that are still allow you to do something else besides podcasts.